So order. Preet Kaur Gill to move the motion. Preet.
Thank you, Sir Mark. I beg to move that this House has considered exempt supported accommodation, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Sir Mark. I am pleased to have been able to secure this debate today on exempt supported accommodation. I would like to start with a thanks to a number of people who I have worked with during the course of this campaign. Jane Haynes at Birmingham Live, Birmingham City Council, the Local Government Association, the HMO Action Group in Birmingham, my local police and many residents I have worked with over the years, including my constituents on Carisbrooke Road and Fountain Road. Since my election in 2017, issues with this kind of housing has been a long-running problem in parts of my constituency in Birmingham Edgbaston. And today I have called this debate because after years of inaction and stalled progress under the previous government, I'm keen now to see fit-for-purpose regulations introduced to finally deal with this issue. I know that ministers have been left with no shortage of challenges by the previous administration when it comes to housing, whether it is the failure to build enough houses, homelessness, cladding removal, or years of inaction on renters' rights. Exempt accommodation reform should have pride of place among the new government's packed agenda, because there really is a great deal on the line for vulnerable residents in communities like mine. As I'm sure the Minister knows, Birmingham has the most units of non-commissioned exempt accommodation in the country, with nearly 28,000 exempt claims across more than 9,000 properties. As the Minister knows, exempt accommodation is a type of supported accommodation that is often used for people with very few housing options, such as prison leavers, rough sleepers, those experiencing substance misuse issues, and so on. It is exempt from the local housing allowance caps because an element of care, support and supervision is supposed to be provided to claimants, although it often isn't. And as a result, organisations providing this type of accommodation can charge very high rates, which has unfortunately clearly led to unscrupulous providers coming into the market and has had the unintended consequence of distorting the local housing market in Birmingham, with the buying up of family homes to be converted into exempt provision. Quality concerns are rife amongst these, and several of the city's largest providers have been issued regulatory notices by the regulator for social housing in recent years. Over the past few years, I have worked closely with providers, residents, the police, the sector and community groups with on-the-ground experience to get to the bottom of why this sector has almost trebled in our city since 2018 and why so much of this accommodation is substandard and poorly managed. The causes of this are multifaceted and complex, but it is the view of myself and my constituents that the new regulations to be introduced via the Supported Housing Oversight Act are well overdue. My closest experience of the sector was in working with the council, the police and the community in 2021 to shut down Safe Lodge in my constituency, which had become infamous in the area as an epicentre of crime. This was the first case in the country of an exempt property being shut down after residents and I presented extensive evidence of incidents of prostitution, drug dealing, aggression and other antisocial behaviour. We found vulnerable residents with substance abuse, mental health supports being let down by filthy, cramped, poor quality accommodation and a dire lack of support. I had been aware of some of the issues of Safe Lodge since I was elected, but after my constituents alerted me to the shocking rise in crime surrounding this property, I carried out a spot check with the police to see for myself what was actually happening. I was shocked by what I found. 25 men and women, including ex-offenders, housed with several issues ranging from addiction and substance misuse to mental health problems. Just one solitary support worker on duty who told me that the hostel was manned only on weekdays, with residents otherwise left to their own devices. The conditions were utterly substandard, cold, filthy and cramped. The downstairs toilet broken and flooded and been left unfixed. The smell was hair-raising. Access to the property was via a code that was regularly shared with strangers who were always in and out of the property. Communal spaces were in a state. It is no wonder residents were frequently found spilling out and loitering outside. This was not a place where any of us could happily live, let alone get a life back on track following a crisis. As part of this campaign, I set up an exempt campaign group with residents and conducted a number of spot checks of such properties in my constituency. And through this work, and working with the council, MPs, providers and community groups across Birmingham, I got to see up close how poor much of this provision can be across my constituency and indeed across Birmingham City. In the case of Safe Lodge, we were successful in securing an order for it to be shut down. Good, you may think. Substantial time and resources went into this campaign. It took over a year to see this through, and it is only one example among many across Birmingham which have been letting people down. That's why councils and the police need powers to address the ongoing concerns in the exempt sector. Safe Lodge was a symptom, a feature, not a bug of the system. I think it is telling insight that since Safe Lodge was boarded up, it has since been found to have been turned into a cannabis farm housing marijuana with a street value stretching into the hundreds of millions of pounds. The owners even applied to change the use of the property to provide support for women and children. Clearly, they should never be allowed to provide any supported accommodation. I have always contended that organised crime has been attracted to this sector, and this has reinforced my suspicions that some people are targeting this sector for all the wrong reasons. With the regulations Parliament agreed to last year, that must change. I campaigned strongly for a new regulatory regime to be introduced to clamp down on poor quality exempt provision in the last Parliament, including the introduction of minimum standards of support, changes to housing benefit regulations for a definition of the minimum standards of care, of support and supervision, and new powers for local authorities to better manage their local supported housing market and ensure rogue landlords cannot exploit the system. I was pleased to see many of my recommendations, including in the Housing Select Committee's excellent report on this issue and subsequently translated into law in the Supported Housing Regulatory Oversight Act. This would require local authorities to review and develop strategies to deal with exempt accommodation in their areas. It would give the Secretary of State power to introduce national support standards and consider a new planning use class for exempt provision and give councils powers to create local licensing schemes. It's an important piece of legislation to clamp down on those private providers that have opened large buildings purporting to be supporting people, but are at best accommodation and at worst dangerous places to live for the vulnerable people who are placed there. Since a year since that act was passed with cross-party support, we still do not have the operating regulations or even the consultation promised by the previous government. A consultation on the regulations was first promised in the early 2024, then it was delayed to March and then delayed again with the general election. So I would be grateful to the Minister if she can set out today the new timelines for when she intends to begin consultation and lay the new regulations today. After the previous government's failure to get on with this, I know that councils will be listening closely today, seeking more clarity on what to expect over the coming year. The delays to date have left councils with few means to challenge poor providers other than through housing benefit claims, which of course is problematic for residents. It has also left councils in receipt of funding through the Supported Housing Improvement Programme facing a cliff edge in support, with funding due to end in March 2025. A gap in funding between SHIP funding and new burdens funding for the Act could mean that many councils have to let go of skilled staff members, which I'm sure the Minister would agree would be completely unsatisfactory. Birmingham City Council has used this funding for a programme of inspections of exempt accommodation in the city, and what they found is genuinely shocking. They discovered more than 10,000 Category 1 and 2 health and safety hazards in exempt properties since 2020, of which now 97% have now been removed. In that time, thousands of support plan reviews have been completed and overpaid housing benefits of more than 7.23 million has been reclaimed. I'm sure the Minister will agree that this has been a valuable investment, and I would like to seek her reassurance that SHIP funding will continue while we await the new regulations. What is most revealing, however, is what this programme has revealed about the state of the sector and why this regulation is sorely needed. Through this work, the Council has seen an increase in social issues around community safety and poor quality support provided. 73 properties were decommissioned by the Council. The Council made over 2,000 support plan reviews for adult social care, 88 adult safeguarding reviews initiated, and more than 2,600 claims were cancelled due to the care, support or supervision failing to meet the Council's more than minimal threshold. So, Mark, that really is saying something, considering how weakly this is currently defined with the so-called more than minimal test. Visiting Safe Lodge, I remember talking to the security guard there and asking them if they were the support worker. They weren't. But if a resident asked them for support, they would say that they simply made a phone call to refer the resident or signpost them to a service. That was their version of care, support and supervision. That is what the uncapped housing benefit was paying for, while the owners of the property raked in the profit. In addition, the Council state that from inspections they have logged thousands of community safety incidences connected to these properties, with over 1,700 investigations having taken place, 544 evictions and 48 arrests. A key concern of mine is how people are being referred and placed into these properties. You can imagine the chaos when it comes to making sure compatible residents are being assessed and placed together. Indeed, many residents are not properly assessed and placed at all. I have heard cases of vulnerable women being put together with men with serious issues, and alarming cases where women have been insulted in some of these properties. That is why these regulations are so important. Clear operating guidelines are needed for councils now. Until we have these regulations, despite the good work I've mentioned through the Supported Housing Improvement Programme, which I will give the government credit for, councils will remain unequipped to enforce minimum standards of care, support and supervision that vulnerable residents need and deserve. In turn, I have no doubt that this will improve the levels of antisocial behaviour and other forms of crime that have sprung up around some of the exempt provision in my constituency that have caused considerable grief for residents around Fountain Road, Gillett Road and other roads leading off the Hagley Road in my constituency. It is why I think everyone in the supported housing sector, councils and indeed my constituents will welcome clarity from the Minister today. If I may, I would like to finally move on to some specific questions. I remember a meeting in 2022 in which government officials remarked that they were too light on data to get on with reform at that point. What I found a quite startling admission, which I sincerely hope is not the case now. Previously, the government did commit to improving the data that it collects on the sector. Could the Minister provide an update on this work? And can the Minister also update us on the progress she has made on developing national support standards, including what constitutes a minimal level of care, support and supervision? It is absolutely vital that these regulations are put on the statute book, in my view. I'm sure the Minister is aware that in the absence of the promised regulations due to the aforementioned delays, some councils are preemptively setting their own standards, which from their point of view will prepare the sector for the introduction of new standards, but from the supported sector's perspective, risk creating policy inconsistency that may have negative consequences for smaller providers that are otherwise doing a very good job. Does the Minister agree with me that the repeated delays to consultation and the development of regulations promised by the last government have created a lot of uncertainty, which is ultimately unhelpful to the good providers of supported housing in the sector and the residents that they protect? In my view, it is welcome that Birmingham City Council has its own quality standards scheme, but I note that without regulations, this scheme can only be voluntary, and thus only 45% of providers currently engage with it. That is undoubtedly a huge challenge to all of us who want to drive up standards in the sector rather than see a continuation of the race to the bottom we have seen over the past 14 years. Finally, I would like to seek the Minister's view on creating a new planning use class for exempt accommodation to help councils identify exempt provision at an earlier stage and therefore better manage it in parts of the city where exempt accommodation is already saturated. I know from my own constituency this is part of the problem with crime hotspots in my patch, with an incredibly negative impact on my constituents who live there. I'm sure the Minister will agree with me that the government's commitment to restore community policing will really help in this respect, and my constituents know keenly the value of a local officer who knows the community, and we need to see more of our officers on our streets. To conclude, Sir Mark, new regulations to tackle poor provision in the exempt accommodation sector are desperately overdue. Birmingham now has an excess of 28,000 exempt units, and that number just simply continues to grow. Since reforms of the supported housing system were shelved in 2018, the exempt accommodation sector has ballooned. An FOI from Crisis revealed a 62% increase from 2016 to 2021, so the longer we delay, the greater the scale of the challenge when new regulation inevitably comes in place. And over the past decade, too many bad landlords have been getting into this sector for precisely the wrong reasons. They have exploited under regulation, a conservative housing crisis, and an epidemic of unmet need after years of council cuts. There are fantastic providers also operating in Birmingham who are trying to do the right thing, but they are being undermined by those seeking to profiteer and shortchange vulnerable people in their care. That is bad for the supporting housing sector as a whole. If I have one ask of the Minister today, it is to make sure that this new government gets on with the urgent task of reform, where the previous government did it and delayed, and to ask if she can set out a refreshed timeline today. Survivors of domestic violence, prison leavers, care leavers, and people with mental and substance abuse issues deserve a supported housing system that supports their transition to happier, more independent lives. Our communities in Birmingham deserve neighbourhoods that are peaceful and safe, not epicentres of antisocial behaviour. And the taxpayer deserves to know that their money is going to support people who need it, not lining the pockets of rogue landlords. I thank the Minister in advance. Thank you.